When my husband walked out on our 15-year marriage for his 24-year-old yoga instructor, he thought he had it all figured out. He'd been sneaking around for months, thinking I was just the boring housewife who paid the bills while he found his spiritual awakening with Valentina. What he didn't know was that the Serenity Springs Wellness Studio where they met, I owned it. The building, the business, the lease, everything. So when he showed up that Tuesday morning expecting his usual private session with his new girlfriend, he found the locks changed and a permanently closed sign on the door. Because 30 minutes earlier, I'd fired Valentina and shut down the studio indefinitely. His face when he realized his wife wasn't just the woman he left behind, but the woman who controlled his entire new life. Priceless. But that was just the beginning of how I dismantled everything he thought he'd stolen from me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Every morning started the same way in our quiet Millbrook home. I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of Timothy's meditation chimes echoing from the guest bedroom, where he'd started sleeping 6 months ago because my energy was apparently disturbing his spiritual practice. I'd brew his special organic coffee, blend, the expensive one that cost $47 a pound, pack his designer yoga mat into the leather bag I'd bought him for his birthday, and have his green smoothie ready by the time he finished his hour-long morning routine. "Thanks, Hazel," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone as he kissed my cheek. The affection felt mechanical, like checking an item off a to-do list. "Don't wait up tonight. I've got that advanced flow class again. Valentina says I'm really making progress with my practice." Those late yoga classes had become routine over the past 8 months. 3 nights a week had turned into 4, then sometimes 5. Timothy Jackson, my husband of 15 years, had transformed from the practical accountant I married into this spiritual seeker who spoke in Sanskrit, phrases he'd obviously Googled and constantly talked about aligning his chakras and finding his authentic self. At first, I was genuinely supportive. After years of marriage, if yoga made him happy, I wanted to be happy for him. Lord knows our relationship had been going through a rough patch. We'd been trying to have children for years before finally accepting it wasn't going to happen, and that loss had created a distance between us that neither of us seemed to know how to bridge. When Timothy discovered yoga and meditation, I thought, maybe it was exactly what he needed to find peace with our situation. I supported him completely. I bought him the expensive yoga equipment, the organic supplements, the meditation cushions, the books by every spiritual guru he mentioned. When he wanted to take weekend retreats, I never complained about spending our vacation fund. When he decided our house needed to be cleansed of negative energy and threw away half our furniture, I went along with it and bought new pieces that fit his minimalist aesthetic. While Timothy explored his spiritual awakening, I kept our practical life running. I managed my small accounting firm from our converted home office, handling books for local restaurants, boutiques, and small businesses throughout Millbrook. The work was steady and profitable, nothing glamorous, but it paid our mortgage and funded Timothy's increasingly expensive journey to enlightenment. The yoga studio he'd been attending, Serenity Springs Wellness, had become the center of his universe. He'd talk endlessly about the incredible instructor there, Valentina Martinez, who apparently had studied with masters in India and could help him unlock his spiritual potential. According to Timothy, she was this amazing teacher who really understood his journey and saw his authentic self in ways that others couldn't. "Valentina says I have natural leadership energy," he'd tell me over dinner, his eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't when looking at me in months. "She thinks I could even teach someday once I deepen my practice more." I'd nod and smile, asking interested questions about his poses and breathing techniques, even though something about his enthusiasm made my stomach twist uncomfortably. But I pushed those feelings down, telling myself I was being paranoid or jealous of something innocent. The changes in Timothy weren't just spiritual, they were physical too. He'd started eating differently, following some special diet plan that Valentina had recommended. He'd begun working out more, developing muscle definition I hadn't seen since our early 20s. He bought new clothes, trading his conservative, button-downs for fitted athletic wear and linen shirts that showed off his newly toned physique. "I'm just feeling more connected to my body," he'd explain when I complimented his appearance. "Valentina teaches that physical wellness and spiritual wellness are inseparable." Valentina. Her name came up in every conversation. Valentina said this. Valentina recommended that. Valentina believed in holistic living. I started to feel like there were 3 people in our marriage. The most telling change was how Timothy had begun treating our home like a hotel. He'd come in from his classes, shower immediately, and retreat to his separate bedroom to process the energy work he'd done that day. Our conversations became superficial, limited to logistics about schedules and household maintenance. The man who used to tell me about every detail of his day now shared nothing except yoga philosophy and Valentina's wisdom. I found myself walking on eggshells, careful not to disturb his spiritual practice or question his new lifestyle too directly. When I'd suggest we spend time together, he'd remind me that he was on an important personal journey and needed space to grow. When I'd express concern about our growing distance, he'd tell me I was being possessive and holding him back from his highest self. "You need to do your own inner work, Hazel," became his standard response to any of my attempts to address our relationship problems. "You can't expect me to be responsible for your happiness." The irony wasn't lost on me. While Timothy pursued his individual awakening, I was the one actually taking care of everything that kept our life functioning. I paid our bills, managed our investments, maintained our house, and dealt with all the practical responsibilities he'd begun dismissing as lower vibrational concerns. I'd lie awake in our king-sized bed, which now felt enormous and empty, wondering when I'd become the obstacle to my husband's happiness instead of his partner in building it. I'd married Timothy because he was stable, reliable, and kind. We'd built a good life together, or so I thought. But apparently, that good life had become a prison he needed Valentina to help him escape from. What I didn't understand then was that Timothy wasn't just escaping from our marriage. He was planning his exit strategy, and he thought I was too, focused on my mundane accounting work, and too spiritually unaware to notice what was really happening right in front of me. He had no idea that the woman he saw as his boring, practical wife had her own secrets. Like the fact that I didn't just do bookkeeping for small businesses in Millbrook. I owned several of them, including a wellness studio that had been operating under a management company for the past 3 years, a wellness studio called Serenity Springs. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, while Timothy was at what he called his sunrise meditation session, but what I suspected was actually breakfast with someone else. I was in my home office, reviewing quarterly reports for my clients, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Jackson? This is Detective Sarah Coleman with the Millbrook Police Department. I'm calling about an incident at Serenity Springs Wellness Studio." My stomach dropped immediately. Not because I was worried about Timothy, though that thought did cross my mind, but because Serenity Springs was my property, and any police incident could affect my business insurance and liability coverage. "What kind of incident?" I asked, already pulling up the studio's file on my computer. "There was a break-in last night. The alarm company tried to reach the primary contact, but the number on file appears to be disconnected. They listed you as the secondary emergency contact and property owner." Property owner. Right. Because while Timothy thought he was having his spiritual awakening at some independent wellness sanctuary, he was actually paying monthly fees to practice yoga in a building his wife owned. "I'll be right there," I told the detective, grabbing my keys and trying to process what this meant. A break-in at my studio. On the same morning, my husband happened to be missing from his usual routine. The drive to Serenity Springs took 12, minutes through Millbrook's quiet residential streets. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the past 3 years, but always for business reasons. Meeting with the management company, reviewing lease agreements, checking on maintenance issues. I'd never been there as the wife of a student. Timothy didn't even know I knew where the studio was located. When I arrived, I found Detective Coleman waiting outside with a small, nervous-looking woman I recognized as Maria Santos, the studio manager I'd hired through the property management company. Maria handled day-to-day operations while I remained the silent owner, a business arrangement that had worked perfectly until this moment. "Ms. Jackson," Maria said, looking relieved to see me. "I'm so sorry about this. Nothing like this has ever happened before." Detective Coleman was professional but thorough. The break-in occurred around 2 a.m. Someone used a key to enter through the back door, but they must have been unfamiliar with the alarm system because they triggered it within 30 seconds. By the time our officers arrived, whoever it was had fled. "What was taken?" I asked, though I was more concerned about liability issues than missing inventory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's the strange part," the detective continued. "Nothing appears to be missing, but we found some personal items left behind." She handed me an evidence bag containing a men's wallet and a set of car keys I recognized immediately. Timothy's wallet. Timothy's BMW keys. My hand started shaking as I stared at the familiar brown leather wallet I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. The keys attached to the small meditation charm he'd bought at some spiritual retreat last year. "Do you recognize these items?" Detective Coleman asked, studying my reaction carefully. I couldn't lie to a police officer, but I also couldn't fully process what I was looking at. "Yes, they belong to my husband, Timothy Jackson." Maria's face went pale. "Timothy? But he's one of our regular students. Why would he break into the studio?" "That's what we need to figure out," the detective said. "Do you have any idea why your husband might have been here at 2 a.m.? I didn't have an answer, at least not one I wanted to say out loud, but the possibilities swirling in my mind were making me nauseous. "We'll need to speak with him, Detective." Coleman continued. "Is he available?" "He's not home right now," I managed. "He said he was going to a sunrise meditation session." "Where?" I realized I didn't actually know. Timothy had been vague about his morning activities for weeks, and I'd stopped asking for specifics because his answers always made me feel like I was being controlling or unsupportive of his spiritual journey. After giving my statement and contact information, I stayed behind to assess any damage with Maria. The studio looked normal, mats stacked neatly, props organized, the retail area untouched. But as we walked through the space, Maria mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "You know, it's funny," she said, straightening some meditation cushions. "Timothy's been asking a lot of questions about the building lately, about the lease terms, the ownership structure, things like that. I thought maybe he was interested in teaching here someday." "What kind of questions?" "Well, last week he asked if the owner ever came by and whether the studio was profitable. And a few days ago, he wanted to know about our security system. Said he was concerned about safety for the female instructors who sometimes stay late." The female instructors. Like Valentina Martinez, the young yoga teacher who'd become the center of Timothy's spiritual universe. "Speaking of Valentina," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Was she scheduled to be here last night?" Maria checked her tablet. "Actually, yes. She had a private session booked from 8 to 10 p.m. with a client, and then she usually stays to practice on her own for another hour or two. But she called in sick around 6 p.m. and canceled everything. Called in sick. The same night, my husband apparently broke into the studio at 2 a.m. I left Serenity Springs with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that my marriage was even more broken than I'd realized. Timothy wasn't just distant and obsessed with yoga. He was sneaking around my own property in the middle of the night, leaving behind evidence that could have gotten him arrested. When I got home, Timothy's BMW was in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be found. I called his phone and heard it ringing from somewhere upstairs. Following the sound, I found it on his nightstand in the guest bedroom, along with a spare set of car keys he must have used to drive home. I sat on his meditation cushion, staring at his phone, and made a decision that 3 months ago I never would have considered. I picked it up and entered his passcode, our wedding anniversary, which he apparently hadn't thought to change. What I found in his text messages destroyed what was left of my trust in him, but it also gave me the clarity I needed to understand exactly what had been happening in my marriage. The most recent conversation was with someone named V, obviously Valentina, and it painted a picture of a relationship that had moved far beyond yoga instruction. Can't wait to see you tonight. Maria won't be there after 6, so we'll have the place to ourselves. I found out more about the building ownership. It's complicated, but I think there might be a way to make this work for us. She has no idea. Still thinks I'm just her spiritual student. This is going to be easier than we thought. And then, the message that made me understand why Timothy had been at my studio at 2 a.m. I'm going to get the spare key from your office. If we're going to do this, we need to figure out the security situation first. See you after midnight. I scrolled back through weeks of messages, each one revealing more details of an affair that had been happening literally in my own building, funded by my own money, while I sat at home supporting Timothy's spiritual journey. But what made me angriest wasn't just the betrayal, it was the stupidity. Timothy thought he was being clever, planning some kind of future with Valentina that involved my property. He'd been asking questions about the studio's ownership and profitability because he was trying to figure out how to steal my business, along with my husband. What he didn't know was that the woman he thought was too boring and practical to notice his affair was the same woman who owned the building where he was planning his new life. As I sat there reading message after message, between my husband and his lover, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months of our deteriorating marriage. Absolute clarity. Timothy had made his choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. For the next 2 weeks, I did something that surprised even me. Absolutely nothing. I didn't confront Timothy about the break-in, didn't mention finding his wallet at my studio, didn't bring up the text messages I'd read on his phone. Instead, I fell into a strange state of watchful waiting, like a scientist observing a fascinating but dangerous experiment. Timothy came home that Tuesday afternoon acting completely normal, as if he hadn't spent the previous night breaking into his wife's property to meet his mistress. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and complained about losing his wallet somewhere during his morning meditation session. "I've looked everywhere," he said, patting his pockets dramatically. "I must have dropped it at the park or something. I'll need to cancel my credit cards." I watched him lie to my face with an ease that was almost impressive. "I'm sure it'll turn up," I told him, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. That evening, Detective Coleman called to inform me that they'd completed their investigation of the break-in. Since nothing was stolen and they had no witnesses, they were closing the case unless new evidence emerged. She mentioned they'd attempted to contact Timothy about his belongings but couldn't reach him. "I'll make sure he gets his things back," I assured her, already planning how I'd handle that conversation. But I didn't handle it at all. Instead, I fell into the strangest period of my marriage, a time when I knew everything but pretended to know nothing. I became hyper-aware of Timothy's every move while acting completely oblivious to his deception. When he left for his yoga classes, I'd smile and remind him to drive safely. When he came home late with obvious signs of physical activity, that had nothing to do with downward dog poses. I'd ask innocently about his practice. When he mentioned Valentina's incredible teaching techniques, I'd nod with interest and ask follow-up questions. "She sounds amazing," I'd say. "Maybe I should try one of her classes sometime." Timothy's reaction to that suggestion was telling. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary," he'd say quickly. "Her teaching style is very advanced. You'd probably be more comfortable with a beginner instructor." The implication was clear. I wasn't spiritually evolved enough for Valentina's elevated instruction. What Timothy didn't realize was that I could have Valentina teaching beginner classes or unemployed entirely with a single phone call. But I didn't make that call. Not yet. Instead, I found myself in a bizarre pattern of enabling Timothy's affair while secretly gathering intelligence about it. I'd do his laundry and notice the unfamiliar perfume on his yoga clothes. I'd organize his supplements and see new ones that Valentina had obviously recommended. I'd clean his car and find receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, clearly from his dates with her. The strangest part was how Timothy seemed to interpret my lack of confrontation as acceptance, or maybe even ignorance. He became bolder in his deception, staying out later, being less careful about covering his tracks, even taking phone calls from V while I was in the same room. Just discussing my spiritual progress, he'd tell me after hanging up from conversations that were clearly personal rather than instructional. One evening, I overheard a particularly revealing call while Timothy was in the backyard, apparently thinking the sliding door would muffle his voice. "She doesn't suspect anything," he was saying. "Hazel's completely absorbed in her accounting work. She barely notices when I'm gone. There was a pause while Valentina responded. Then Timothy continued, "I know, baby. It won't be much longer. Once we figure out the studio situation, we can make our move." The studio situation. My studio situation. That night, I did something I'd never done in 15 years of marriage. I went through Timothy's belongings systematically. Not in a frantic, emotional way, but methodically, like the accountant I was, looking for patterns and evidence. In his dresser drawer, hidden under meditation books, I found printouts of property records for Serenity Springs. Timothy had obviously done research into the building's ownership, but the records only showed the management company's information, not my name as the actual owner. There were also handwritten notes about rental costs for similar properties in the area, and what appeared to be a rough business plan for a wellness center. He was planning to steal my business model, along with my husband's status. In his laptop bag, I discovered a folder labeled New Beginnings, containing apartment listings in nearby towns, job applications for yoga studios in other cities, and printed emails about teacher certification programs. Timothy wasn't just cheating on me, he was planning his entire exit strategy. But the most devastating discovery was a handwritten letter, clearly a draft of something he intended to give me eventually. "Hazel, I know this will be difficult for you to understand, but I've found my true path in life. Valentina has helped me realize that our marriage has been holding both of us back from our authentic selves. I need to follow my spiritual calling, and that means making some difficult changes. I hope someday you'll understand that this is what's best for both of us. I'll always care about you, but I can't pretend to be someone I'm not anymore." This letter went on to outline a proposed division of our assets that was laughably unfair to me, clearly written by someone who had no idea what his wife actually owned or earned. Timothy was planning to take half of everything he knew about while walking away with a 24-year-old yoga instructor and the business plan he'd stolen from my property. As I read his pathetic justification for destroying our marriage, I felt the last remnants of my love for him finally die. But what replaced it wasn't just anger. It was a cold, calculating determination to show Timothy exactly who he'd been underestimating for the past 8 months. Still, I said nothing. I continued making his organic coffee every morning. I continued doing his laundry and packing his yoga bag. I continued asking interested questions about his spiritual journey and Valentina's teachings. But now I had a plan. The final push I needed came during a dinner conversation 2 days later. Timothy was talking about his future goals, speaking, in the hypothetical way people do when they're actually describing concrete plans they don't want to reveal yet. You know, Hazel, I've been thinking about what would happen if I ever decided to teach yoga professionally, he said, cutting into the organic salmon I'd prepared according to Valentina's recommended anti-inflammatory diet. That sounds interesting, I replied, taking a sip of the expensive kombucha he'd insisted we start buying. Valentina thinks I have real potential. She says with the right opportunity, I could even open my own studio someday. Your own studio? That sounds like a big investment. Timothy's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm I recognized but hadn't seen directed at me in months. Actually, it might not be as expensive as you'd think. There are ways to make it work if you know the right people and understand the market. He was talking about my market, my property, my business. Would you want to stay in Millbrook? I asked. Innocently? Maybe not, Timothy said, and I could see him mentally editing his response in real time. I mean, there might be better opportunities in other places. More spiritual communities, you know? What he meant was places where his wife wouldn't accidentally discover his new life with his yoga instructor girlfriend. That night, after Timothy left for another advanced practice session, I made a decision. I'd spent 2 weeks watching my husband plan to steal my business and abandon our marriage while I played the role of the oblivious wife. I'd enabled his affair by pretending not to notice it, and I'd watched him develop an exit strategy that would leave me with nothing while he started fresh with a woman young enough to be our daughter. The acceptance phase was over. It was time for Timothy to learn that the boring, practical wife he'd been deceiving wasn't nearly as naive as he thought. And it was time for Valentina Martinez to discover that sleeping with her student's husband came with consequences she'd never considered. I picked up my phone and called Maria Santos, my studio manager. Maria, it's Hazel Jackson. We need to talk about some changes at Serenity Springs. The meeting with Maria was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 a.m., deliberately chosen because I knew Timothy would be at what he called his sunrise flow session. But what I now understood was probably breakfast with Valentina at some romantic cafe. I arrived at Serenity Springs 15 minutes early, sitting in my car and staring at the building I owned, but had never entered as anything other than a landlord. The irony was overwhelming. For 8 months, I'd been funding my husband's affair through my own property, paying the utilities that kept the lights on for his secret rendezvous, maintaining the building where he fell in love with another woman. Every monthly profit statement I'd reviewed had included revenue from Timothy's membership fees, money he'd taken from our joint account to pay for the privilege of cheating on me in my own studio. Maria greeted me at the front entrance, looking nervous. In the 3 years she'd managed Serenity Springs for me, we'd only met in person a handful of times, usually for lease renewals or major maintenance issues. This was different, and she could sense it. Is everything okay with the property? She asked as we walked through the main studio space. After the break-in last week, I've been worried about security issues. Actually, Maria, that's exactly what I want to discuss. But first, I need you to walk me through something. Tell me about Valentina Martinez. Maria's expression shifted immediately. Valentina? She's one of our newer instructors. Very popular, especially with the male students. Why do you ask? How long has she been teaching here? About 8 months. She came to us from a studio in Phoenix, said she wanted a fresh start in a smaller community. Maria paused, studying my face. Is there a problem with her work performance? 8 months. The exact time frame when Timothy's spiritual awakening had begun and our marriage had started disintegrating. What can you tell me about her teaching methods? Her relationships with students? Maria shifted uncomfortably. Well, she's very hands-on with her instruction. Some students love the personal attention, but we've had a few complaints from other female students about her being too flirty with their boyfriends or husbands. Have you addressed these complaints? I spoke with Valentina about maintaining professional boundaries, but she insisted she was just being encouraging and supportive. She said some women are intimidated by confident female instructors. Maria looked at me carefully. Mrs. Jackson, is this about your husband? Because I have to tell you, there have been some observations. My heart started pounding. What kind of observations? Well, Timothy has been requesting private sessions with Valentina exclusively for the past few months, and they often stay after regular classes to practice together. Last week, one of our evening students mentioned seeing them in the parking lot having what looked like a very intimate conversation. Maria led me to her small office behind the reception area and closed the door. I probably should have called you about this sooner, but I wasn't sure how to handle it. Valentina is technically following studio policies. Private sessions are allowed, and instructors can stay after hours to practice. But the dynamic between her and Timothy seems unprofessional. And Timothy has been asking a lot of questions about the business side of the studio. Last month, he wanted to know about our profit margins and lease terms. When I told him that information was confidential, he said he was thinking about opening his own place and wanted to understand the industry better. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Timothy hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been conducting business espionage on my own property, using his relationship with Valentina to gather intelligence about my investment. Maria, I need to see Valentina's employment file and Timothy's membership records. Of course, but can I ask why? I took a deep breath. Because I'm going to fire Valentina today, and I'm going to cancel Timothy's membership permanently. Maria's eyes widened. You're firing her? On what grounds? Violation of professional ethics, inappropriate relationships with clients, and I paused, realizing I was about to reveal something that would change how Maria saw me forever. Potential conspiracy to defraud the property owner. I don't understand. Maria, Timothy doesn't just go to yoga here. He's been having an affair with Valentina for months, planning to steal our business model and using information he's gathered here to compete against us. The break-in last week? That was Timothy trying to access areas of the building he shouldn't have been in. Maria stared at me in shock. But why would he? Oh my God. Mrs. Jackson, are you saying your husband has been cheating on you with our instructor? I'm saying my husband has been cheating on me with our employee in our building, using our facilities, while planning to steal our business and destroy our marriage. As Maria pulled up the files on her computer, I saw the full scope of what had been happening under my nose. Valentina's employment application listed previous experience at studios that, when I Googled them, appeared to be either defunct or non-existent. Her references were phone numbers that led to voicemail boxes with generic messages. Timothy's membership showed an escalating pattern of private sessions, special classes, and after-hours facility usage that painted a clear picture of their relationship's progression. But the most damning evidence was in the handwritten notes Maria kept about studio incidents and concerns. Over 8 months, she documented multiple complaints about Valentina's inappropriate behavior with male clients, 3 instances of unmarked private sessions that weren't properly recorded in the booking system, and several occasions when Valentina had been found in areas of the building she shouldn't have had access to. She's been systematically violating studio policies, Maria said, scrolling through the documented incidents. I should have terminated her months ago, but she always had explanations, and her classes were popular. Popular with married men, whose wives weren't watching closely enough, I said bitterly. Then Maria showed me something that made my blood run cold. Security camera footage from the week before the break-in. The timestamp showed Valentina giving Timothy a tour of the building's back offices and storage areas, pointing out the alarm system controls and showing him where spare keys were kept. She was helping him case the building, I whispered, watching. My husband and his mistress planning their criminal activity on my own security system. Mrs. Jackson, this is so much worse than I realized. If they were planning to steal proprietary information or compete against us illegally, we could have grounds for a lawsuit. A lawsuit. The idea hadn't occurred to me, but as I sat there looking at evidence of my husband's betrayal, and his girlfriend's professional misconduct, I realized this wasn't just about a marriage ending. This was about business fraud, breach of contract, and conspiracy. Maria, I want you to prepare termination paperwork for Valentina immediately, effective today. And I want you to revoke Timothy's membership and ban him from the property. What reason should I give for Valentina's termination? Violation of professional conduct policies, inappropriate relationships with clients, unauthorized access to secure areas, and conspiracy to commit theft of proprietary business information. As Maria began preparing the paperwork, I called my business attorney, Jonathan Wright, who handled contracts and disputes for several of my properties. Jonathan, it's Hazel Jackson. I need to discuss some urgent legal matters regarding employee termination and potential business fraud. After explaining the situation, Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Hazel, what you're describing could constitute several different types of legal violations. If your husband and this instructor were planning to use proprietary information to compete against your business, that's industrial espionage. If they were accessing areas of your building without authorization, that's criminal trespass. And if she was using her position to facilitate an extramarital affair, that's definitely grounds for immediate termination. What do you recommend? Document everything. Preserve all evidence. Terminate the employee immediately for cause, which means no severance or benefits. And consider whether you want to pursue criminal charges for the break-in and trespassing. Criminal charges against my own husband. As I hung up the phone, Maria handed me Valentina's termination letter, already printed and ready for signature. She's scheduled to teach a class at 2 p.m. today. Do you want me to handle this or... No, I said, signing the letter with a steady hand. I'll handle this myself. For 8 months, I'd been the invisible woman in the background of my husband's spiritual awakening. I'd supported his journey, funded his classes, and enabled his affair without even knowing it. Timothy thought he was so clever, planning his new life with a woman who was young enough, flexible enough, and spiritual enough to give him everything his boring wife couldn't. What neither of them realized was that the boring wife controlled every aspect of the space where they'd built their fantasy future. At 1:45 p.m., I positioned myself in the studio's main room, sitting in the back where I could see everyone who entered. Students began arriving for Valentina's 2 p.m. Vinyasa flow class, including several faces I recognized from Timothy's social media posts about his yoga journey. At exactly 1:58 p.m., Valentina Martinez walked through the front door, looking like everything I wasn't. Young, graceful, radiant with the kind of confidence that comes from being desired by someone else's husband. She was wearing expensive athleisure wear that I probably helped pay for through Timothy's generous tips for private instruction. She didn't notice me in the back of the room as she began setting up for class, arranging props and queuing up music. At 2:02 p.m., just as she was about to begin the session, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the studio. "I'm sorry, but this class has been canceled. Valentina Martinez is no longer employed by Serenity Springs Wellness, effective immediately." The look on Valentina's face was everything I'd hoped it would be. Pure shock. That's what I saw in Valentina Martinez's eyes as she stood frozen at the front of the yoga studio, holding a meditation bowl that she'd been about to use to start class. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak, but no words came out. The 15 students who'd arrived for her Vinyasa flow class looked confused, turning their heads between Valentina and me like they were watching a tennis match. "I'm sorry. What?" Valentina finally managed, her voice higher than the sultry confidence tone I'd heard on Timothy's voicemails. "Who are you?" "I'm Hazel Jackson," I said clearly, making sure everyone in the room could hear me. "And I own this building." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Valentina's mind racing, trying to process this information and figure out how it connected to her sudden termination. Behind her, several students were whispering to each other, and I caught fragments of their conversations. Jackson. Isn't that Timothy's last name? Wait, is this his wife? Oh my God. Valentina's face went from shocked to pale to something approaching panic. Mrs. Jackson, she said, her voice now trembling slightly. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Maria didn't mention anything about— There's no misunderstanding, I interrupted, pulling the termination letter from my purse. You're being terminated for violation of professional conduct policies, inappropriate relationships with clients, and conspiracy to commit business fraud. This is effective immediately. I handed her the letter while the yoga students watched, in fascination. Valentina's hands were shaking as she read it, and I watched the color drain completely from her face when she reached the part about unauthorized access to secure areas and conspiring with clients to obtain proprietary business information. I don't understand, she stammered. Business fraud? I would never. You helped Timothy Jackson access areas of this building he had no authorization to enter. You provided him with information about our business operations, lease terms, and security procedures, and you've been conducting an inappropriate personal relationship with a married client in violation of your employment contract. The room was so quiet, I could hear the soft background music still playing from Valentina's phone. One of the students in the back row pulled out her own phone and appeared to be recording the confrontation. Good. I wanted this documented. Mrs. Jackson, Valentina said, attempting to regain some composure. I think you're confused about my relationship with Timothy. He's a dedicated student who's made remarkable spiritual progress under my guidance. If you're having marital problems, that's not my— I've read the text messages, I said simply. Those 5 words hit Valentina like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, bumping into the small altar she'd set up with candles and crystals. I've seen the security footage of you giving him a tour of areas he shouldn't have been in. I know about the break-in attempt. I know about your dinner dates, your plans to open a competing studio, and your detailed discussions about my husband leaving me for you. Valentina's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice now desperate rather than confident. Timothy said you two were separated. He told me your marriage was over and you were just living as roommates while you figured out the divorce details. A few of the yoga students gasped. The woman in the back row definitely had her phone out recording now. Timothy lied to you, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. We're not separated. We're not getting divorced. And until this conversation, he had no idea that I know about your relationship. I could see Valentina processing this information, realizing that everything Timothy had told her about our marriage and my knowledge of their affair was false. But instead of looking remorseful, she looked angry. Dangry. Well, maybe you should ask yourself why your husband was looking for something better, she snapped, some of her earlier confidence returning. A man doesn't stray unless he's not getting what he needs at home. The audacity of this statement, delivered in my own building, in front of witnesses, by the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband while I unknowingly paid her salary, was so breathtaking that I actually laughed. You're right, I said. Timothy wasn't getting what he needed at home. He wasn't getting enough drama, enough chaos, or enough criminal activity. Apparently, a stable marriage with a woman who supported his dreams and funded his hobbies wasn't exciting enough. I'm not a criminal, Valentina protested, and I'm not responsible for the problems in your marriage. You're right about the first part, I agreed. You're not a criminal, yet. But that could change if I decide to press charges for conspiracy, to commit theft and trespassing on private property. For the first time, Valentina looked genuinely frightened. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. I have security footage, documented policy violations, witness statements from other students about your inappropriate behavior, and a very detailed record of your employment violations. I gestured around the room. Plus, I now have witnesses to your admission that you've been having a relationship with Timothy, which violates the professional conduct clauses in your employment contract. The yoga students were completely absorbed in this drama unfolding in front of them. I realized that by tomorrow, everyone in Millbrook would know exactly what had happened at Serenity Springs today. I want you to gather your personal belongings and leave immediately, I continued. Your access card has been deactivated and you're banned from this property permanently. If you attempt to return or contact any of our clients, I'll consider it harassment and file a restraining order. Valentina stood there for a moment, still holding the termination letter, looking like she was trying to figure out if she could salvage this situation somehow. Finally, she walked to the small cabinet where instructors kept their personal items and began shoving things into her yoga bag. This isn't over, she said quietly as she passed me on her way to the door. Yes, it is, I replied. And Valentina? Timothy doesn't know I own this studio. When he shows up for his next private session with you, he's going to find the doors locked and a very interesting note waiting for him. After Valentina left, I turned to address the confused yoga students still sitting on their mats. I apologize for disrupting your class, I said. Maria will be in touch about rescheduling with one of our other qualified instructors. Thank you for your patience. As the students filed out, buzzing with conversation about what they'd just witnessed, I sat alone in the empty studio for the first time in my life. This was my space, my investment, my business. For 8 months, I'd been an invisible presence, here while my husband fell in love with another woman and planned to steal my livelihood. But now, for the first time since discovering Timothy's affair, I felt powerful instead of victimized. My phone buzzed with a text message from Timothy. Heading to Serenity Springs for my session with Valentina. Should be home around 8. I stared at that message for a long moment, imagining Timothy's confusion when he arrived to find the studio closed and Valentina nowhere to be found. He would call her, panicking, trying to figure out what had happened to their secret meeting place. But before he could piece together what had gone wrong, he was going to get a much bigger shock. I drove home and spent the next 3 hours going through every document in Timothy's New Beginnings folder, every text message on his phone, every piece of evidence I'd collected about his affair and his plans to leave me. I organized it all methodically, like the accountant I was. Bank statements, phone records, property research, job applications, apartment listings. By the time Timothy came home at 8:30 p.m., confused and agitated from finding Serenity Springs, locked up with no explanation, I had everything laid out on our dining room table like a legal brief. Hazel, the weirdest thing happened, he said as he walked through the front door. The studio was completely closed when I got there, and Valentina isn't answering her phone. Maria wasn't there either, and he stopped talking when he saw me, sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, his phone records printed out, and his handwritten letter to me placed prominently in the center of everything. Hi, honey, I said calmly. How was your spiritual practice today? For the second time that day, I got to watch someone's face go through the same progression of emotions. Confusion, recognition, shock, and finally, pure panic. Hazel, Timothy said slowly. What is all this? This, I said, gesturing to the evidence spread across our table, is the end of your spiritual awakening and the beginning of your very practical education about what happens when you try to steal from your wife. Timothy stood frozen in our foyer for what felt like an eternity, staring at the dining room table covered with evidence of his double life. I watched his face cycle through emotions, confusion melting into recognition, recognition hardening into panic, and finally, panic transforming into something I'd rarely seen from my husband, genuine anger. You went through my private things, he said, his voice low and accusatory. You violated my privacy. The audacity of that statement was so overwhelming that I actually felt my mouth fall open. After 8 months of lies, after planning to steal my business and abandon our marriage, after breaking into my property to meet his mistress, Timothy's first response was to accuse me of violating his privacy. Your privacy, I repeated slowly, standing up from the dining table. You're concerned about your privacy? Yes, Timothy said, walking toward the table but not sitting down. Marriage doesn't give you the right to go through my personal belongings and read my private communications. What you've done here is a violation of trust. I stared at my husband, really looked at him, and realized I was seeing the real Timothy Jackson for the first time in our 15-year marriage. Not the steady accountant I'd fallen in love with, not the spiritual seeker he'd pretended to become, but the entitled, selfish man who could cheat on his wife for 8 months and then lecture her about violating trust. A violation of trust, I said, my voice eerily calm. Like sleeping with your yoga instructor? Timothy's jaw tightened. That's different. Different how? My relationship with Valentina is about spiritual connection and personal growth. It's not about hurting you. It's about finding my authentic self. The casual way he said my relationship with Valentina hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't even denying it anymore. He was justifying it. Your authentic self, I repeated. And your authentic self includes breaking into my building? Timothy blinked, momentarily confused. Your building? Serenity Springs Wellness Studio. I own it. Timothy, I've owned it for 3 years. I watched this information hit him like a freight train. His face went white, then red, then white again as he processed the implications. That's impossible, he said quietly. You're an accountant. You work from home doing bookkeeping for small businesses. I am an accountant, I agreed. Which is why I know how to structure business investments and manage multiple revenue streams. Serenity Springs is one of 6 properties I own in this area. Timothy sat down heavily in one of our dining room chairs, staring at the evidence spread in front of him as if seeing it for the first time. You own the studio where you've been cheating on me? Yes. Where you broke in last week to meet Valentina? Yes. Where you've been gathering proprietary business information to steal my business model? Also, yes. I wasn't stealing anything, Timothy said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. I picked up the handwritten notes he'd made about rental costs and business plans. Then what do you call this? Market research for your hobbyist meditation practice? Timothy looked at the papers in my hand, and I could see him trying to figure out how to spin this situation in his favor. The man who'd been lying to me for 8 months wasn't going to start telling the truth now. Hazel, you have to understand, he said, his voice taking on the same condescending tone he used when explaining spiritual concepts he thought I was, too practical to grasp. I've been going through a profound personal transformation. My connection with Valentina opened my eyes to possibilities I never knew existed. Possibilities like committing adultery and business fraud. It's not adultery. When a marriage is already spiritually dead, Timothy snapped, finally showing some real anger. Do you know what it's like being married to someone who has no interest in growth, in exploration, in anything beyond paying bills and organizing spreadsheets? There it was. The real reason for Timothy's affair, stripped of all the spiritual justification and personal growth rhetoric. I was boring. I was practical. I wasn't evolved enough for his newly awakened consciousness. So this is my fault, I said quietly. I didn't say that. Timothy backtracked quickly, but his tone remained defensive. I'm saying that people grow apart. What we had 15 years ago doesn't have to define what we need now. What we had 15 years ago was a partnership. What we have now is me supporting your spiritual journey while you plan to leave me for a woman barely older than our non-existent daughter. Timothy flinched at that reference. We'd tried for years to have children, and our inability to conceive had been one of the deepest sources of pain in our marriage. Using it now was a low blow, but I was past caring about fighting fair. Don't bring that into this, Timothy said, his voice sharp. That has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with this, I said, my voice rising for the first time in the entire conversation. We went through the hardest thing in our marriage, together, and instead of letting it make us stronger, you decided to find someone new who doesn't carry any of that history. Timothy was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through to him. But when he spoke again, his words destroyed any hope I had for salvaging our relationship. Maybe that's exactly what I needed, he said quietly. Someone, without all our baggage, someone who sees my potential instead of my failures. The finality in his voice told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a man who was confused or going through a midlife crisis. This was a man who had made a calculated decision to replace his wife with a newer model, and who had spent months planning his exit strategy. Well then, I said, sitting back down at the dining table, let me tell you about your potential future, Timothy. Valentina was fired today for professional misconduct and violating her employment contract. She's been banned from Serenity Springs. Permanently. Your membership has been revoked, and you're also banned from the property. Timothy's eyes widened. You can't do that. I absolutely can do that. It's my building. But my membership fees were paid from our joint account using money that I contributed to more than you did, since my accounting business has been more profitable than your job for the past 3 years. I pulled out our financial records. Would you like to see the breakdown? Timothy stared at the bank statements showing my business deposits compared to his salary, and I watched him realize that his spiritual awakening had been funded primarily by his wife's boring practical work. This is ridiculous, he said, standing up abruptly. You can't control my relationships or my spiritual practice just because you own a building. You're right, I agreed. I can't control your relationships, but I can protect my business from theft, and I can protect myself from a husband who's been planning to leave me while using my money to fund his affair with my employee. Timothy began pacing around the dining room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. So what now? You're going to try to keep me prisoner in this marriage? Force me to stay with someone I'm not compatible with anymore? I'm not keeping you prisoner, I said calmly. You're free to leave anytime you want, but you're not taking half of everything I've built while pretending this is about spiritual growth instead of midlife selfishness. Half of everything we've built, Timothy corrected. This is a marriage, Hazel, community property. And there it was. The real reason. Timothy had been researching my business assets and gathering information about property values. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to take half of everything I owned, including businesses he'd never known existed until today. Community property, I repeated. Like the yoga studio where you've been cheating on me? Timothy stopped pacing. That's different. How is it different? Because I didn't know you owned it. So it's only stealing if you know you're stealing from your wife specifically. Timothy's face flushed red. I wasn't stealing anything, and I wasn't cheating. Valentina and I have a spiritual connection that transcends physical. Timothy, I interrupted. I read your text messages. I saw the photos you sent her. There's nothing spiritual about what you two have been doing in my studio. The silence that followed was deafening. Timothy had been caught in so many lies that he couldn't keep track of which stories he'd told to whom. His carefully constructed narrative about spiritual awakening and personal growth had crumbled under the weight of evidence and reality. Fine, he said finally, his voice cold and angry. You want the truth? Yes, I've been seeing Valentina. Yes, we've been planning a future together. And yes, I was going to leave you, because this marriage is dead, Hazel. It's been dead for years, and we've both been too cowardly to admit it. Then leave, I said simply. Timothy blinked, surprised by my response. What? Leave. Pack your things and go. Move in with Valentina. Start your new spiritual life. open your own yoga studio. I'm not stopping you. But the property division, our assets, will be handled by lawyers, I finished. Because as of right now, Timothy, you and I have nothing left to discuss as husband and wife. Timothy stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to figure out whether I was bluffing. When he realized I wasn't, his expression hardened into something I'd never seen before, pure contempt. You know what your problem is, Hazel? He said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think owning things makes you powerful, but all the buildings and businesses in the world can't change the fact that you're a bitter, controlling woman who drove her husband away. I looked at Timothy, really looked at him, and felt the last remnants of love I'd been carrying finally die. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of my house. Now. Take whatever you can carry tonight and come back for the rest when I'm not here. Timothy stood there for a moment, apparently expecting me to back down or start crying or beg him to reconsider. When I simply stared at him with calm determination, he realized I was serious. Fine, he said, heading toward the stairs. But don't think this is over. I'm entitled to half of everything, and I'm going to get it. As Timothy stomped upstairs to pack, I remained sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal. For the first time in 8 months, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do next. Timothy wanted a war? He was about to learn that his boring, practical wife was much better at strategic warfare than he'd ever imagined. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house for the first time in 15 years. Timothy had packed 3 suitcases and left, around midnight, taking his meditation cushions, yoga equipment, and enough clothes for an extended stay. He'd also taken our wedding photo from the dresser, though whether out of sentimentality or spite, I couldn't tell. I made coffee for one person and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, creating a comprehensive action plan like I would for any major business project. The difference was that this project involved protecting everything I'd built from a husband who'd decided he deserved half of it as compensation for his infidelity. My first call was to Jonathan Wright, my business attorney, at exactly 8 a.m. Jonathan, it's Hazel Jackson. I need to schedule an emergency consultation about divorce proceedings and asset protection. Of course. How soon can you be here? How about now? An hour later, I was sitting in Jonathan's downtown office with 3 banker's boxes full of financial records, business documents, and evidence of Timothy's affair. Jonathan, a methodical man in his 50s who'd handled several complex divorces for successful women, listened without interruption as I explained the situation. Let me make sure I understand, he said, reviewing the timeline I'd prepared. Your husband has been having an affair with an employee at a business you own. He broke into your property to facilitate this affair, and he's been gathering proprietary business information with the apparent intent to compete against you? That's correct. And he doesn't know the full extent of your business holdings? I handed Jonathan a folder containing property deeds, business registrations, and financial statements. Over the past 8 years, while Timothy thought I was just doing bookkeeping from home, I'd been systematically investing in commercial real estate and acquiring small businesses. In addition to Serenity Springs, I owned 2 apartment buildings, a small strip mall, and had partnership stakes in 4 local businesses. He knows about our joint accounts and the house, I said. But he doesn't know about my individual business assets. Everything was purchased with income from my accounting firm, kept in separate business accounts, and structured as individual ownership rather than marital property. Jonathan spent 20 minutes reviewing my documents, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. Finally, he looked up with something approaching admiration. Hazel, this is some of the cleanest asset protection I've seen. Your business attorney did excellent work structuring these investments. You're my business attorney, Jonathan. You helped me set up most of these entities. He blinked, then laughed. Right. I forgot you keep your personal and business matters so compartmentalized. Most of my clients talk about their marriages during business meetings. Most of your clients don't have husbands planning to steal their business models. Jonathan's expression grew serious again. About that, what Timothy and his girlfriend were doing could constitute several different crimes: industrial espionage, conspiracy to commit theft, criminal trespass. Have you considered pressing charges? I'd been thinking about exactly that. Question since yesterday's confrontation. Would criminal charges help or hurt the divorce proceedings? They could help significantly. If Timothy is convicted of crimes related to your business, it would strengthen your argument that he shouldn't receive any portion of those assets in the divorce. Then let's pursue every available option. Jonathan made several notes, then looked at me carefully. Hazel, I have to ask, are you prepared for how nasty this could get? Timothy is going to hire his own attorney, and when he realizes how much money is actually involved, he's going to fight aggressively for his share. Let him fight, I said simply. I have documentation for everything, and I have the law on my side. After leaving Jonathan's office, I drove to the Millbrook Police Department to file a formal complaint about the break-in at Serenity Springs. Detective Coleman, who'd handled the original incident, was surprised to see me back. Mrs. Jackson, did you remember something new about the break-in? I remembered that the person whose belongings you found is my husband, and I'd like to press charges for criminal trespass and attempted theft. Detective Coleman's eyebrows rose. Your husband? Are you sure you want to pursue criminal charges? Against your spouse? My soon-to-be ex-husband, I corrected. And yes, I'm absolutely sure. Filing the police report took 2 hours and required a detailed statement about Timothy's affair, his relationship with Valentina, and the evidence I'd gathered about their plans to use proprietary business information. Detective Coleman was thorough and professional, though I could tell she was struggling to understand how a marriage could deteriorate to the point where a wife would press criminal charges against her husband. Mrs. Jackson, she said as I was preparing to leave, you should know that if we pursue these charges, it's going to become public record. The local media might pick up the story. Good, I said. I wanted on record exactly what happened. My next stop was the most important. Lunch with my sister Claire, who'd driven down from Hartford as soon as I'd called her that morning with a brief explanation of what had happened. Claire was waiting for me at Millbrook's nicest restaurant, looking appropriately outraged on my behalf. At 52, she was 3 years older than me and had gone through her own messy divorce 5 years earlier. If anyone would understand the complexities of protecting assets from a vindictive spouse, it was Claire. I always knew Timothy was too good to be true, she said after I'd filled her in on all the details. 15 years of marriage, and he throws it away for a 24-year-old yoga instructor? It's pathetic. It's not just pathetic, I said. It's expensive. He's going to try to claim half of everything I've built. Claire studied the financial documents I'd brought. As a successful real estate developer, she understood business structures and asset protection better than most attorneys. Hazel, this is impressive, she said, reviewing my property portfolio. You've built a substantial business empire while he thought you were just balancing checkbooks. How much does he actually know about your finances? He knows what he sees in our joint accounts and what I've told him about the house payment. He has no idea about the individual business assets. And everything is properly documented as separate. Property? Everything. Jonathan helped me structure it all correctly from the beginning. Claire smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from anyone since this nightmare started. Then Timothy Jackson is about to get the education of his lifetime about underestimating his wife. After lunch, Claire insisted on accompanying me to my afternoon appointment with Dr. Rebecca Foster, a forensic accountant who specialized in complex divorce cases. Dr. Foster had been recommended by Jonathan as someone who could perform a comprehensive analysis of our marital and separate assets. Dr. Foster was a sharp woman in her 40s who got straight to business. Mrs. Jackson, I understand you need a complete financial analysis for divorce proceedings. Are there any particular concerns about asset concealment or valuation disputes? My husband doesn't know the full extent of my business assets, I explained, and he's been conducting what amounts to industrial espionage on one of my properties. Dr. Foster took detailed notes as I explained the situation, asking specific questions about business structures, income sources, and asset acquisition timelines. After 2 hours of analysis, she had a preliminary assessment. Based on what you've shown me, the vast majority of your business assets would be classified as separate property under Connecticut law, she said. However, your husband could argue for reimbursement if any marital funds were used for business expenses, or for a portion of appreciation that occurred during the marriage. What's the worst-case scenario? If a judge decided that some of your business success was due to marital support, you being able to focus on building your businesses because your husband provided emotional and financial stability, he might award Timothy a small percentage. But based on your documentation, I'd estimate his maximum claim at maybe 10% of your business assets. 10% of several $1 million was still substantial, but it was far less than the 50% Timothy was probably expecting. What's the best-case scenario? Claire asked. Given the adultery, the business espionage, and the criminal charges Mrs. Jackson is pursuing, the best case would be that Timothy receives nothing from the business assets and only half of the marital home and joint accounts. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing everything that had happened in the past 2 days. 48 hours ago, I'd been the oblivious wife enabling her husband's affair. Today, I had assembled a legal team, filed criminal charges, and begun the process of protecting assets worth several $1 million. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Valentina. We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Valentina Martinez had nothing to say that I needed to hear, but Timothy did call, around 9 p.m., his voice tight with anger. "Hazel, what the hell did you do? The police just called me about criminal charges?" "I filed a complaint about the break-in at my property," I said calmly. "You left your wallet and keys at a crime scene, Timothy. What did you expect?" "This is insane. You can't press charges against your own husband." "I can press charges against anyone who breaks into my business," I corrected. "The fact that the criminal happens to be my soon-to-be ex-husband is irrelevant." There was a long silence on the line. "Hazel, we need to talk. This has gotten completely out of hand." "You're right," I agreed. "It got out of hand 8 months ago when you started planning to steal my business and leave me for your girlfriend. Now it's just getting handled properly. I want to come home so we can discuss this rationally." "You don't have a home here anymore, Timothy. And if you set foot on my property, I'll call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." Another long silence. "Fine. My attorney will be in touch." After he hung up, I sat in the quiet house and realized something remarkable. For the first time in 8 months, I felt completely in control of my own life. Tomorrow, Timothy would discover that his boring, practical wife had spent years building something much larger and more valuable than he'd ever imagined. And he was about to learn that stealing from a woman who understood business, law, and strategic planning was the biggest mistake of his life. 3 days after Timothy moved out, his attorney made contact. The law firm of Morrison, Blake & Associates was exactly what I'd expected: expensive, aggressive, and specializing in high-asset divorces. The initial letter they sent was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, demanding full financial disclosure and threatening to pursue Timothy's rightful share of all marital assets. What they clearly hadn't expected was for me to respond within 24 hours with my own attorney's letter, along with a comprehensive financial disclosure that revealed assets they'd never imagined existed. "Mrs. Jackson," said Marcus Morrison during our first phone conference, his voice noticeably less confident than his initial letter had suggested. "My client was unaware of the extent of your business holdings. We'll need time to review these documents and assess the situation." "Take all the time you need," Jonathan replied smoothly. We'll be conducting our own investigation into your client's criminal activities and business espionage in the meantime. The investigation phase of my divorce became the most educational experience of my life. I learned things about Timothy, about our marriage, and about my own capabilities that I never could have imagined 6 months earlier. Dr. Foster's forensic accounting analysis was the first major revelation. Over 2 weeks, she combed through 8 years of financial records, tracing every dollar I'd earned, invested, and spent. Her final report was 127 pages of meticulous documentation that painted a picture of financial responsibility that even I found impressive. "Hazel," Dr. Foster said when she presented her findings, "you've been essentially supporting your husband's lifestyle while building a substantial business empire. In the past 5 years, your income has exceeded his by an average of 40%. The money you used to purchase and improve your investment properties came entirely from your individual business accounts, never from marital funds." The numbers were staggering. My accounting firm had generated over $2.3 million in revenue over 8 years. My real estate investments had appreciated by $1.8 million. My business partnerships had produced another $600,000 in value. While Timothy thought I was earning a modest income doing bookkeeping, I'd actually built a portfolio worth over $4.5 million. $5 million. What about his claim to marital support? I asked. Could he argue that his emotional and domestic support enabled my business success? Dr. Foster smiled grimly. That's where your documentation becomes crucial. You've kept detailed records showing that you handled 90% of household management, all of the financial planning, and most of the domestic responsibilities while building your businesses. Timothy's support appears to have consisted mainly of consuming the lifestyle your earnings provided, but the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source, Timothy himself. My private investigator, a former police detective named Angela Chen, had been tracking Timothy's activities since he moved out. What she discovered was that Timothy's spiritual awakening had been far more calculated than even I had realized. "Mrs. Jackson," Angela said during our weekly update meeting, "your husband has been systematically researching business acquisition strategies for the past year. He's taken online courses in franchise management, attended seminars on wellness center operations, and even consulted with business brokers about purchasing existing yoga studios." She handed me a folder containing printouts of Timothy's browser history, credit card statements for educational courses, and correspondence with business consultants, all of which painted a picture of someone who'd been planning to enter the wellness industry long before he'd met Valentina. "This wasn't a spiritual awakening," I said, reviewing the evidence. "This was a career change. He was researching how to get into the yoga business, and Valentina was his way in." "It gets worse," Angela continued. "I've tracked his communications. With Valentina back 14 months, their relationship began 2 months before he ever took his first yoga class. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Timothy hadn't fallen in love with his yoga instructor. He'd targeted a yoga instructor, developed a relationship with her, and then used that relationship to gain access to my business while planning his own competing venture. How did they meet? Social media. Valentina was posting about looking for new opportunities in smaller markets. Timothy reached out to her privately, claiming he was interested in bringing a high-quality instructor to Millbrook. They were having dinner dates before he ever set foot in your studio. I stared at the timeline Angela had constructed, showing the progression of Timothy's relationship with Valentina alongside his increasing interest in my daily routines, my work schedule, and my business activities. What I'd interpreted as supportive interest in my career had actually been reconnaissance. "There's more," Angela said, pulling out another folder. "Valentina's employment history is largely fabricated. The studios she claimed to have worked for in Phoenix either don't exist or have never heard of her. Her yoga certifications are from online programs that require no actual training or testing. So she's a fraud too. She's a fraud who's been running the same con in multiple cities. I found records of her in Denver, Austin, and Portland, always targeting small wellness businesses and forming relationships with male clients or business owners. She typically stays 8 to 12 months before moving on. The picture emerging from Angela's investigation was devastating. Timothy had been the victim of a long-term con, but he'd also been a willing participant in attempting to defraud me. Valentina was a professional manipulator, but Timothy had provided her with access to my business and confidential information. Meanwhile, Jonathan was building our legal case with military precision. He'd obtained all the security footage from Serenity Springs, showing Timothy's unauthorized access to restricted areas. He'd documented every policy violation and breach of his membership agreement. Most importantly, he'd traced the financial impact of Timothy's industrial espionage. Hazel, we can prove that Timothy gained access to proprietary information about your business operations, customer demographics, pricing strategies, and vendor relationships, Jonathan explained during one of our strategy sessions. If he'd successfully opened a competing studio using this information, it could have cost you hundreds of thousands in lost revenue. What about the adultery? Connecticut is a no-fault divorce state, so the adultery itself doesn't affect property division. But the fact that the affair was conducted on your business property, using your resources, and involved theft of your proprietary information, that creates financial damages we can pursue. The most satisfying part of the investigation phase was watching Timothy's legal strategy crumble as his attorneys realized what they were up against. His initial demands for 50% of all assets quickly dropped to 30%, then 20%, as the evidence mounted against him. Marcus Morrison called Jonathan directly after receiving Angela's investigation report. "Your client has been very thorough," Morrison said, his tone now entirely professional rather than threatening. "Perhaps we should discuss a settlement that avoids the expense and publicity of a trial." "My client is open to reasonable settlement discussions," Jonathan replied. "But your client will need to understand that his criminal activities have significantly impacted his position in these proceedings." The criminal case was proceeding in parallel with the divorce. Detective Coleman had arrested Timothy on charges of criminal trespass and attempted theft. While the charges were relatively minor, they established a legal record of Timothy's willingness to commit crimes against his wife's business interests. Valentina had also been arrested on related charges, though she'd immediately hired her own attorney and was reportedly considering a plea bargain that would require her to testify about Timothy's involvement in planning their business theft. "She's going to throw him under the bus," Angela predicted. "She's done this before, and she knows how to minimize her own legal exposure." As the investigation phase concluded, I found myself with a comprehensive understanding of exactly what had happened to my marriage and why. Timothy hadn't been seduced by a yoga instructor. He'd entered into a business partnership with a con artist, using my resources and my property to fund their scheme. When their plan failed, he'd tried to salvage the situation by claiming his rights as a husband to assets he'd been attempting to steal. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Timothy's own computer. When he'd moved out, he'd left behind an old laptop he thought was broken. Angela's computer forensics expert had recovered its hard drive, revealing months of planning documents, research files, and correspondence that showed the full scope of Timothy's intended fraud. "Hazel," Jonathan said after reviewing the computer evidence, "I've never seen a divorce case with this level of documentation proving deliberate bad faith by one spouse. Timothy didn't just cheat on you. He attempted to commit a complex business fraud using your marriage as cover." As I sat in my home office, surrounded by bankers' boxes full of evidence, I realized that the investigation had revealed more than just Timothy's crimes. It had shown me that the boring, practical woman he'd dismissed as spiritually unaware was actually a sophisticated businesswoman who'd been supporting both of their lifestyles while building significant wealth. Timothy had made the classic mistake of underestimating his opponent. He'd assumed that because I handled mundane tasks like paying bills and organizing schedules, I lacked the intelligence or resources to fight back when he decided to destroy our marriage. He was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. The next phase would be going public with what we'd discovered, and I was looking forward to showing the Millbrook community exactly what kind of man Timothy Jackson really was. The decision to go public wasn't strategic, it was inevitable. Small towns have their own ecosystem of information flow, and Millbrook had been buzzing with gossip about the incident at Serenity Springs since the day I'd fired Valentina in front of her yoga class. But the story people were telling wasn't the whole truth, and I decided it was time to set the record straight. It started with a phone call from Jennifer Walsh, a reporter for the Millbrook Gazette who'd heard about the criminal charges against Timothy and Valentina. "Mrs. Jackson, I understand your husband and a local yoga instructor have been charged with criminal trespass at a wellness studio you own. Would you be willing to discuss the situation on the record?" I was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Going public would make our private devastation a matter of public record. But staying silent would allow Timothy and his attorneys to control the narrative. "Yes," I said finally. "I think it's time people knew what really happened." Jennifer arrived at my house that afternoon with a photographer and a digital recorder. She was a professional journalist in her 40s who'd covered several high-profile divorce cases in Hartford before moving to Millbrook for a quieter pace of life. She wasn't looking for salacious gossip. She wanted the real story. "Mrs. Jackson, can you explain how you discovered your husband's relationship with Ms. Martinez?" I walked Jennifer through the timeline methodically, starting with Timothy's supposed spiritual awakening and ending with the discovery of their business conspiracy. I showed her the documented evidence, the security footage, the financial records, the computer files revealing Timothy's calculated deception. "So, this wasn't just an affair," Jennifer said, reviewing the investigative reports. "This was an attempted business fraud that used adultery as a cover story. Exactly. Timothy didn't fall in love with his yoga instructor. He targeted a con artist who specialized in defrauding wellness businesses, provided her with access to my property and confidential information, and planned to steal my business model while claiming it was about spiritual growth." Jennifer spent 3 hours reviewing documents and asking detailed questions. When she left, I knew the story she'd write would be comprehensive and accurate, exactly what I needed to counter any narrative Timothy might try to create. The article ran on the front page of the Millbrook Gazette 3 days later, under the headline, "Local Businesswoman Exposes Husband's Elaborate Fraud Scheme." Jennifer had done excellent work, presenting the facts clearly while avoiding sensationalism. She'd even included sidebar articles about business fraud prevention and the legal rights of business owners in divorce proceedings. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. the morning the article was published. The first call was from Patricia Williams, the president of the Millbrook Business Association. "Hazel, I had no idea you owned so many properties in our community," she said. "The Business Association would like to invite you to speak at our next meeting about entrepreneurship and asset protection." By noon, I'd received calls from 12 other business owners, 3 attorneys who wanted to refer clients to me, and 2 real estate investors interested in partnership opportunities. Word was spreading beyond Millbrook. By evening, I'd been contacted by reporters from Hartford and New Haven who wanted to discuss the broader implications of the case. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Other women. "Mrs. Jackson, you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for speaking out," said the first caller, a woman who identified herself only as Sarah. "My ex-husband tried something similar with my catering business. Seeing how you fought back gives me hope that I made the right decision to protect what I'd built." Over the next week, I received dozens of similar calls. Women who'd been through divorces where husbands had tried to claim credit for businesses they'd built. Women whose spouses had attempted to steal proprietary information or customer lists. Women who'd been told they were too controlling or not supportive enough, when they'd tried to protect their professional interests. "You've become a symbol," Claire told me during one of our weekly check-ins. "Every woman who's ever had a man try to steal her success is living vicariously through your revenge." The attention wasn't universally positive. Timothy's supporters, and he still had some, began pushing back with their own narrative. A few people suggested I was being vindictive, that pressing criminal charges against my own husband was excessive, that a real woman would have tried to save her marriage instead of destroying it. These critics didn't understand the full scope of what Timothy had done, and I decided they needed to hear it directly from me. The Millbrook Community Center hosted monthly coffee and conversation events where local residents could discuss community issues. I'd never attended one before, but in mid-April, I called them to request a speaking slot. "I'd like to address some misconceptions about the situation with my divorce and the criminal charges against my husband," I told the event coordinator. The community center was packed on the night I spoke. Word had spread that Hazel Jackson would be telling her side of the story publicly for the first time, and nearly 200 people showed up, far more than the usual attendance of 20 or 30 regulars. I'd prepared remarks, but when I stood at the podium looking out at faces of people I'd lived among for 15 years, I decided to speak from the heart instead. "Many of you have known me as Timothy Jackson's wife," I began. "Some of you probably think of me as the quiet woman who does bookkeeping from home while her husband explores spiritual growth through yoga. Tonight, I want you to know who I really am." I told them about building my accounting business from nothing, about the calculated risks I'd taken with real estate investments, about the long hours I'd worked while Timothy thought I was just organizing receipts. I explained how I'd supported his spiritual journey financially and emotionally, never knowing he was using my generosity to plan my own destruction. "This isn't a story about a wife who was too controlling or a marriage that died from lack of communication," I said. "This is a story about a woman who worked for 15 years to build something meaningful, and a husband who decided he deserved half of it as payment for planning to leave her." The room was completely silent as I described the evidence we'd uncovered. Timothy's calculated approach to targeting Valentina, their systematic theft of business information, their plans to use my resources to fund their competing venture. "Didn't press criminal charges because I was angry about the affair," I continued. "I pressed criminal charges because what Timothy and Valentina did was criminal. They broke into my business, stole proprietary information, and conspired to defraud me. The fact that Timothy was my husband doesn't make theft legal." After my formal remarks, I opened the floor for questions. Most were supportive, but a few people challenged my decision to air dirty laundry in public. "Mrs. Jackson," said Robert Chen, a local contractor who'd known Timothy professionally, "don't you think this situation could have been handled privately? Taking out advertisements in the newspaper and speaking publicly seems like it's designed to humiliate your husband." I looked at Robert directly. "Mr. Chen, if someone broke into your business, stole your customer lists, and planned to use that information to compete against you, would you handle it privately? That's different. It's exactly the same. The only difference is that the person who robbed me was married to me." The evening ended with a standing ovation from most of the audience. As people filed out, dozens stopped to speak with me personally. Business owners wanted to discuss asset protection strategies. Women shared their own stories of financial manipulation in marriages. Several people apologized for believing gossip about my motives without knowing the full story. But the most significant conversation happened in the parking lot as I was walking to my car. "Hazel." I turned to find Timothy standing by the community center's main entrance, looking haggard and desperate. He'd apparently been waiting outside during my entire presentation. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "This has gone too far." I looked at my ex-husband, really looked at him, and realized that the confident spiritual man who'd left me 6 weeks earlier had been replaced by someone who looked defeated and embarrassed. "You're right," I said. "It has gone too far. You should have thought about that before you decided to steal my business." "I never tried to steal anything from you. You're twisting everything to make me look like a criminal. Timothy, you broke into my building. You conspired with an employee to access confidential information. You planned to use my resources to fund a competing business. Those aren't twisted interpretations. Those are facts documented by security cameras and computer forensics." Timothy was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the reality that his carefully constructed justifications had crumbled under the weight of evidence. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you to accept responsibility for what you did and agree to a fair divorce settlement that doesn't reward you for committing crimes against my business." "And if I don't?" I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd given Timothy in months. "Then we go to trial, and every detail of what you and Valentina did gets presented in open court and reported in the newspaper. Your choice." As I drove home that night, I realized that going public had accomplished something I'd never expected. It had given me my voice back. For 15 years, I'd been the supportive wife who handled practical matters while Timothy pursued his dreams. For 8 months, I'd been the oblivious victim of his deception. But now, I was simply Hazel Jackson, successful businesswoman, community member, and someone who refused to be stolen from, no matter who was doing the stealing. The next phase would be the formal legal confrontation, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had the truth, the evidence, and the support of a community that finally understood exactly what kind of person I really was. 2 weeks after my public presentation at the community center, Timothy's attorney called Jonathan with a settlement proposal. They were offering to drop all claims to my business assets in exchange for me dropping the criminal charges and agreeing to a simple division of our marital home in joint accounts. "It's a reasonable offer," Jonathan told me during our phone conference. "You'd keep everything you've built, and Timothy would walk away with about $150,000 from the house equity and savings accounts. What's your recommendation?" "Honestly, take it. You've won everything you set out to protect, and going to trial always involves some risk, no matter how strong your case is." But I wasn't ready to let Timothy walk away that easily. The criminal charges weren't just about protecting my business. They were about establishing that what he'd done was fundamentally wrong, not just unfortunate. "What if we counteroffer?" I suggested. "I'll drop the criminal charges if Timothy agrees to the financial settlement and also agrees to make a public statement acknowledging his wrongdoing." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "Hazel, that's asking for something that goes beyond financial remedy. You're asking for public humiliation. I'm asking for public acknowledgement of the truth. Timothy will never agree to that." Then we go to trial. The formal divorce hearing was scheduled for May 15th in Hartford Superior Court. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who had a reputation for being thorough and fair in complex financial cases, would preside over what had become one of the most well-documented divorce proceedings in Connecticut state history. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, both legal teams prepared their presentations with the intensity of major criminal trials. Jonathan had organized our evidence into 3 comprehensive categories: financial documentation proving my separate ownership of business assets, evidence of Timothy's criminal conspiracy with Valentina, and character testimony about Timothy's deliberate deception. "We're not just proving that you deserve to keep your assets," Jonathan explained during one of our final preparation meetings. "We're proving that Timothy's actions were so egregious that he deserves to lose even his normal marital rights." Dr. Foster had prepared a detailed financial presentation showing exactly how my business empire had been built with my individual earnings, while Timothy benefited from the lifestyle my income provided. Angela Chen had compiled a timeline of Timothy's deception that read like a white-collar crime case study. Most damaging of all, the computer forensics expert had recovered deleted files from Timothy's laptop showing months of planning documents for what he and Valentina called Project Fresh Start. The criminal case had concluded 2 weeks before, the divorce hearing. Valentina had accepted a plea bargain that required her to testify against Timothy and pay restitution for damages to Serenity Springs. Timothy had been convicted of criminal trespass and fined $5,000, with the conviction remaining on his permanent record. But the divorce trial would be where the real battle was fought. On the morning of May 15th, I arrived at Hartford Superior Court wearing the same navy business suit I'd worn the day I fired Valentina. Jonathan met me at the courthouse entrance, carrying 2 large briefcases full of documentation. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we walked through the metal detectors. "I've been ready since the day I found his wallet at my studio." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but it was packed with observers. Several reporters were present, along with other attorneys who'd come to watch what had become a locally famous case. I was surprised to see Claire, who'd driven down from Hartford to support me, and even Dr. Foster, who'd requested permission to observe the proceedings. Timothy was already seated at the respondents' table with Marcus Morrison and a younger associate, attorney. He looked uncomfortable in his best suit, avoiding eye contact as I took my place at the plaintiff's table. Judge Reynolds called the proceedings to order at 9 a.m. sharp. "This is the matter of Jackson versus Jackson, case number D15CV 2024-0847. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" Jonathan stood first. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to present evidence regarding the division of marital assets and the respondent's misconduct that has affected those assets." Morrison rose next. "The respondent is prepared to defend against the plaintiff's excessive claims and to pursue his rightful share of marital property." The next 6 hours were the most intense courtroom experience of my life. Jonathan methodically presented our case, starting with my business development timeline and building toward Timothy's criminal conspiracy. Each piece of evidence was introduced, with precision, creating an overwhelming narrative of calculated deception. Dr. Foster testified first, explaining how my business assets had been acquired entirely with separate funds and how Timothy had actually been a financial drain on our marriage rather than a contributor to my success. In the 5 years preceding the separation, Dr. Foster told the court, Mrs. Jackson's individual income exceeded Mr. Jackson's by an average of $47,000 annually. The money used to purchase and improve her business properties came entirely from her separate business accounts. Mr. Jackson contributed no capital, labor, or expertise to these investments. Did Mr. Jackson benefit financially from these investments? Jonathan asked. Substantially. Mrs. Jackson used her business income to maintain a lifestyle that Mr. Jackson's salary alone could not have supported. His yoga classes, expensive supplements, retreat expenses, and organic food costs were all subsidized by his wife's business success. Morrison cross-examined Dr. Foster aggressively, trying to argue that Timothy's emotional support and household contributions had enabled my business success. But Dr. Foster had anticipated this argument. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Jackson's business records show that she worked an average of 65 hours per week, while also handling approximately 90% of household management tasks. Mr. Jackson's contributions appear to have been minimal by any objective measure. Angela Chen testified next, walking the court through Timothy's calculated deception with Valentina. The timeline she presented was devastating, showing that Timothy had researched business acquisition strategies for over a year before ever meeting Valentina, had targeted her specifically for her yoga expertise, and had systematically gathered information about my business operations. This was not an affair that developed organically, Angela told the court. This was a planned business conspiracy that used adultery as a cover story. Morrison tried to discredit Angela's investigation, but the evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss. The security footage, computer files, and financial records created an undeniable pattern of deliberate fraud. When Timothy took the stand in his own defense, the contrast with our prepared presentation was stark. Morrison had clearly advised him to express remorse and claimed that his relationship with Valentina had been an error in judgment rather than a calculated scheme. "Your Honor," Timothy said, his voice shaking slightly, "I never intended to hurt Hazel or damage her business. My relationship with Valentina developed naturally through our shared interest in spiritual growth. I understand that my actions were wrong, but they weren't criminal." Jonathan's cross-examination of Timothy was methodical and devastating. He walked Timothy through each lie he'd told, each piece of confidential information he'd shared with Valentina, each step in their plan to open a competing business. "Mr. Jackson, you testified that your relationship with Ms. Martinez developed naturally, but according to your own computer records, you contacted her online before ever taking a yoga class. How do you explain that?" Timothy struggled to answer. I was researching instructors in the area." "For what purpose?" "To find the best spiritual guidance." Jonathan showed Timothy's browser history to the court. "Mr. Jackson, these records show extensive research into yoga studio franchise opportunities, business loan applications, and commercial real estate listings. Was that also for spiritual guidance?" "I was exploring possibilities for the future." "Possibilities? That involved using information you gathered from your wife's business to compete against her?" Timothy's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Timothy's credibility had been completely destroyed by his own documented actions. The final witness was Maria Santos, my studio manager, who testified about Timothy's suspicious questions about business operations and his unauthorized access to restricted areas of the building. "Mr. Jackson asked detailed questions about our profit margins, our lease terms, and our customer demographics," Maria told the court. "When I told him that information was confidential, he said he was thinking about opening his own studio and needed to understand the industry." After all testimony was concluded, both attorneys presented their closing arguments. Morrison made a valiant effort to portray Timothy as a confused husband who'd made poor choices during a difficult period, but Jonathan's closing was devastating. "Your Honor, this case is not about a marriage that failed due to incompatibility or growing apart. This is about a deliberate, calculated attempt to defraud a successful businesswoman by a husband who felt entitled to steal what his wife had built. The evidence shows that Mr. Jackson spent months planning to take Mrs. Jackson's proprietary business information, use it to compete against her, and then claim half of her assets in divorce proceedings as compensation for his theft." Judge Reynolds took a 30-minute recess to review the evidence before rendering her decision. When she returned, her verdict was swift and decisive. "Mr. Jackson, the court finds that your actions constituted a deliberate breach of fiduciary duty to your spouse and an attempt to fraudulently acquire assets through criminal activity. Mrs. Jackson, your documentation of separate asset ownership is comprehensive and compelling. She awarded me complete ownership of all business assets, the marital home, and 75% of our joint accounts, with Timothy receiving only 25% as a generous settlement given his misconduct." But the most satisfying part of Judge Reynolds' decision was her final statement. "The evidence presented in this case demonstrates that Mrs. Jackson built a substantial business empire through her own talent, effort, and investment, while Mr. Jackson attempted to steal credit and ownership for work he never performed. This court will not reward criminal conspiracy with marital assets." As we left the courthouse, Timothy approached me one final time. "I hope you're satisfied," he said bitterly. "You've destroyed my life." I looked at him calmly. "Timothy, you destroyed your own life the day you decided to steal from me. I just made sure you couldn't steal mine, too." The Hartford Courant ran the story of our divorce settlement on their front page the next day. "Millbrook woman wins landmark case against husband's business fraud." The article included excerpts from Judge Reynolds' decision and a photo of me leaving the courthouse with Jonathan. I was smiling in the picture, genuinely smiling for the first time in months. But the real measure of my victory wasn't in the newspaper headlines or the legal documents. It was in the phone call I received that evening from Detective Coleman, Mrs. Jackson. I wanted to let you know that Valentina Martinez has left Connecticut, she said. Her plea agreement required her to provide information about similar schemes she may have run in other states. The FBI is now investigating her activities in Denver, Austin, and Portland. What about Timothy? His criminal conviction is final. He'll have that on his record permanently, which should make it difficult for him to get employment in positions requiring trust or financial responsibility. After I hung up, I sat in my home office, the same room where I'd discovered Timothy's betrayal 4 months earlier, and tried to process what had happened to my life. In less than half a year, I'd gone from being the supportive wife of a spiritually awakening husband to being a publicly recognized businesswoman who'd successfully defended herself against an elaborate fraud scheme. The immediate aftermath of the court victory brought changes I hadn't anticipated. My accounting firm's phone started ringing constantly with new client inquiries. Apparently, the publicity from the divorce case had established my reputation as someone who understood both business strategy and asset protection in ways that other accountants didn't. Mrs. Jackson, we heard about your court case, said Margaret Torres, who owned 3 restaurants in nearby Waterbury. We're looking for an accountant who really understands business security and protecting what we've built. Within 2 weeks, I'd signed contracts with 8 new clients, all of whom had specifically sought me out because of the expertise I'd demonstrated in protecting my own assets. My income was going to increase by at least 40%, and I'd gained a specialization in forensic accounting and business fraud prevention. But the most satisfying calls came from women who'd been inspired by my case to take action in their own situations. Jackson, my name is Karen Phillips, said one caller. I saw your story in the newspaper, and I think my husband might be doing something similar with my catering business. Would you be willing to recommend the investigators and attorneys you used? I spent that phone call walking Karen through the warning signs I'd learned to recognize, the types of evidence to look for, and the steps to take to protect business assets during a divorce. By the end of our conversation, she had the names of 3 professionals who could help her situation. You probably saved my business, Karen said before hanging up. Thank you for showing other women that we don't have to just accept being stolen from. The Millbrook Business Association invited me to serve on their board of directors, specifically to chair a new committee on small business security and fraud prevention. Patricia Williams, the association president, explained that my case had highlighted vulnerabilities that many local business owners hadn't considered. Hazel, you've shown that business fraud can come from the people closest to us, Patricia said during our first committee meeting. We need to help our members protect themselves from internal threats as well as external ones. I accepted the position and began developing workshops on asset protection, partnership agreements, and recognizing the warning signs of business espionage. Within 3 months, these workshops were drawing attendees from throughout central Connecticut. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence of my victory was what happened to Serenity Springs Wellness Studio. With Valentina gone and Timothy banned from the property, I had to decide what to do with the business. Maria Santos had done an excellent job managing operations, but several clients had canceled their memberships after the public attention surrounding the case. I understand if you want to close the studio, Maria told me during one of our weekly meetings. This whole situation has been incredibly disruptive. I'd been considering selling the property, but something made me hesitate. Serenity Springs had been the site of Timothy's betrayal, but it had also been the place where I'd first asserted my power and taken control of my own life. Maria, what if we completely rebranded? Different name, different focus, different mission. What did you have in mind? What if we turned it into a wellness center specifically for women going through major life transitions? Divorce, career, changes, empty nest syndrome, all the situations where women need to rebuild their sense of identity and strength. Maria's eyes lit up. That's brilliant. We could offer not just yoga and meditation, but also workshops on financial planning, legal rights, starting businesses. Within 6 weeks, we'd transformed Serenity Springs into Phoenix Women's Wellness Center. The yoga studios became spaces for fitness classes, support groups, and educational workshops. I brought in guest speakers on topics ranging from divorce, law to entrepreneurship, to personal finance. The grand reopening event in August drew over 200 women from throughout the region. Local media covered it as a story of transformation and empowerment, with several reporters noting the symbolic significance of turning the site of my husband's betrayal into a resource for helping other women. This is where I discovered my own strength, I told the Hartford Courant reporter who interviewed me at the reopening. Now I want it to be where other women discover theirs. But the most meaningful moment of the reopening came when Claire pulled me aside during the celebration. "Hazel, do you realize what you've accomplished?" she asked. "6 months ago, you were the invisible wife supporting someone else's dreams. Tonight, you're standing in your own business, surrounded by women you're helping, with a career that's more successful than it's ever been." She was right. The woman who'd found Timothy's wallet in a break-in bag had been replaced by someone I barely recognized but completely admired. I owned properties worth over $4.5 million. I had a thriving accounting practice with a specialized focus that set me apart from every other accountant in the region. I was serving on business boards and teaching workshops that helped other women protect what they'd built. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that I was capable of fighting back when someone tried to take what was mine. 3 weeks after the SAR, Phoenix Women's Wellness Center reopening, I received an unexpected visitor. Timothy showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening, looking haggard and desperate in a way that would have broken my heart 6 months earlier. "Hazel, can we talk?" he asked when I answered the door. "We have nothing to discuss, Timothy. Our divorce is final, and you're not welcome on my property. Please, just 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I stepped outside onto the front porch, leaving the door open behind me so I could retreat quickly if necessary. "What do you want?" Timothy looked older than I remembered, with gray in his hair that hadn't been there during our marriage and lines around his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly, "and to ask if there's any way you'd consider giving me a reference for a job application." The audacity of the request was so stunning that I actually laughed. "You want me to give you a reference after you tried to steal my business?" "Hazel, I can't get hired anywhere. The criminal conviction shows up on every background check, and when employers Google my name, they find articles about the court case. I'm applying for basic bookkeeping positions and I can't even get interviews." "That's unfortunate," I said, feeling no sympathy whatsoever. "But it's also the natural consequence of your choices. I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible mistakes, but I'm trying to rebuild my life, and I need help." I looked at Timothy, really looked at him, and realized that the man who'd once made me feel boring and spiritually unaware was now begging for assistance from the woman he'd tried to destroy. "Timothy," I said calmly, "you spent 8 months planning to steal my business, leave our marriage, and take half of everything I'd built. You conspired with a criminal to gather proprietary information about my assets. You broke into my property and violated every trust I'd ever placed in you. I know. You told me I was holding you back from your authentic self. You said our marriage was spiritually dead. You called me boring and controlling when I tried to protect what I'd worked for." I paused, letting each word sink in. "Your authentic self, Timothy, is someone who steals from people who love him. The consequences you're facing now are exactly what you deserve." Timothy stood on my porch for a long moment, apparently hoping I'd change my mind. When he realized I wasn't going to help him, his expression hardened into the same contempt I'd seen during our final argument. "You know what, Hazel? You did destroy my life, and you're enjoying it." "You're absolutely right," I said, smiling genuinely. "I am enjoying it, because for the first time in 15 years, I'm living my life instead of enabling yours. I went back inside and locked the door. watching through the window as Timothy walked slowly to his car. As he drove away, I realized that this would probably be the last time I ever saw him. The woman he'd married would have felt guilty about his struggles and probably would have tried to help him despite everything he'd done. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that protecting yourself from thieves isn't cruel. It's necessary. That night, I sat in my home office reviewing the business plans for Phoenix Women's Wellness Center, the financial projections for my expanded accounting practice, and the agenda for next week's business association meeting. My calendar was full of appointments with new clients, speaking engagements, and meetings with other business owners who wanted to partner with me. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something entirely my own, and no one could take it away from me. 1 year after finding Timothy's wallet at the police station, I stood in Phoenix Women's Wellness Center watching 30 women participate in our monthly Reclaim Your Power workshop. The speaker that evening was Karen Phillips, the woman who'd called me for advice about protecting her catering business from her husband's theft attempts. Karen had successfully divorced her husband, retained full ownership of her business, and was now helping other women navigate similar situations. Watching her teach strategies for asset protection, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with purpose. The most important thing I learned, Karen told the group, is that you can't protect what you don't acknowledge you own. For years, I thought of my catering business as our business, even though I'd built it entirely myself. My husband's attempt to steal it forced me to recognize that it was mine, and that I had the right to defend it. After the workshop, a young woman named Jessica approached me. "Mrs. Jackson, can I ask you something personal? Do you ever regret how hard you fought? Some people probably think you were too harsh with your husband. Do you ever feel guilty?" It was a question I'd been asked many times, and my answer had evolved as I'd grown more comfortable with who I'd become. "Jessica, if someone broke into your apartment and stole your laptop and savings, would you feel guilty about calling the police?" Of course not. What Timothy did was worse. He didn't just try to steal my possessions. He tried to steal credit for my work and half of everything I'd spent 15 years building. He used our marriage as cover for fraud. I looked around at the faces of women dealing with their own betrayals and transitions. The guilt you're asking about comes from believing women should be endlessly forgiving, that we should prioritize other people's comfort over our own protection. But I learned something important. Protecting what you've built isn't cruel. It's necessary. My life had transformed completely. My accounting practice now had 23 clients specializing in forensic accounting and divorce financial planning. I'd spoken at conferences in Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. about asset protection. Phoenix Women's Wellness Center was booked solid, helping women navigate divorces while protecting their businesses and creating new careers. That evening, as I locked up the center, Maria showed me registration numbers for next quarter. We're at capacity for everything, with waiting lists for the business workshops. "Maybe it's time to expand," I said, reviewing the impressive growth. "Actually," Maria said, pulling out a business plan, "I've been researching franchising the concept. Women in Hartford, New Haven, and Stamford want similar programs in their areas." At home that night, I sat in my office, the same room where I'd discovered Timothy's betrayal 18 months earlier, and reflected on how completely my life had changed. The scared, confused woman who'd found her husband's wallet at a crime scene had been replaced by someone I genuinely liked and respected. My phone buzzed with an email. "Mrs. Jackson, I saw your TED Talk about recognizing financial manipulation in marriage. Would it be possible to schedule a consultation?" The TED Talk had been viewed over 200,000 times, generating responses from women across the country seeking advice and support. The worst thing that had ever happened to me had become the foundation for the most meaningful work I'd ever done. Opened my journal and wrote, December 15th, 1 year and 8 months since discovering Timothy's affair. Tonight, I stood in a room full of women refusing to be diminished or stolen from. Timothy sent another email asking for a job reference. He's been unemployed for 6 months. Part of me wonders if I should feel sorry for him, but mostly, I feel proud that I'm not the woman who would enable his continued irresponsibility. Timothy did me a favor. By trying to steal from me, he forced me to recognize how much I'd accomplished and how strong I really was. By leaving me, he freed me to build a life entirely my own. I used to think love meant sacrificing yourself for someone else's dreams. Now I know that real love, including self-love, means refusing to be diminished by people who don't value what you bring to the world. Tomorrow I'm meeting investors about the franchise proposal. Next month, I'm keynoting a conference in Chicago. Next year, I'm considering writing a book about asset protection for women. The woman who married Timothy was looking for someone to take care of her. The woman I am now takes care of herself and helps a lot of other people do the same. I closed the journal and walked through my house with no one else's name on the deed, turning off lights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new women who needed to learn they were stronger than they realized. As I headed upstairs, I thought about the opening line of my TED Talk. The day I discovered my husband was trying to steal my business was the day I discovered I was worth stealing from. It had taken me 50 years to learn that lesson, but I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure other women learned it sooner. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.